Stretching between the states of Washington and Alaska, Canada's rugged Pacific coastline is a magnificent sculpture of jagged cliffs, chiseled inlets, and rock-hewn islands rising from the pounding surf. As part of the Pacific Northwest, the coast of British Columbia is heavily influenced by the ocean. The North Pacific is a breeding ground for huge masses of moisture-laden air pushed by prevailing winds onto coastal shores. Hurricane-force winds of more than 120 kilometers an hour are not unheard of on America's Pacific coastline. But they usually die down before reaching British Columbia. Usually, but not always. Wednesday, October 10th, 1962. On Vancouver Island, in the British Columbia capital of Victoria, Renee Archibald is packing. She's on her way to Vancouver on BC's Lower Mainland to visit daughter Yvonne and son Charles. At 76, Renee has spent the last 30 years working to foster her native French language and culture in Victoria, and has recently received a diploma from the French ambassador for her efforts.
Victoria had a reputation perhaps of being a place where they rolled up the sidewalks at 9 p.m. It was considered a retirement community with a lot of government, of course, with the provincial government here.
To the west, 42-year-old Toshikazu Koyama prepares for another day of fishing off the coast of Main Island, between Vancouver Island and mainland British Columbia. Known as Dick to his island neighbors, Toshikazu has been a fisherman most of his life.
We were raised in Japan, so, after 1935, we came back. Well, that's his profession because our parents were fishermen before the war.
For almost 20 years, Dick Koyama's boat has been his livelihood, and with it, he has been able to provide for his wife and family.
Well, that's the only profession we could get in those days because of, after the war, since we were evacuated during the war, so, after we went back, and that's about the only profession we could choose. We always watch the sky, like movement of the clouds. All of a sudden, you could see the movement of the cloud, up in the sky. So we knew that the storm was coming.
While the wind can be a problem early in the fishing season, it is rarely a serious issue until much later in the fall. In October 1962, Rod McLeod is just a month into his third year of study at the University of British Columbia.
I had signed up for a course in ichthyology, the study of fishes. And I took this course because I was thinking of going into, the food industry, fishing, processing, that type of thing.
Rod is preparing to take part in his first field trip of the semester, gathering fish samples in the waters off Vancouver's most famous landmark, Stanley Park.
And the park was opened to the public in September 1888 and was used by up to millions of visitors from all around the world by 1962. And by 1962, it had become like a defining symbol of the city of Vancouver and the so-called jewel of the park system in Vancouver. The park, through a lot of portions, has remained natural and forested with just a few trails.
By noon Wednesday, clouds are moving in over Stanley Park and the rest of Vancouver. The forecast for the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island calls for scattered showers, but this doesn't dampen Renee Archibald's spirits. In this part of Canada, this type of weather is not unusual for this time of year.
Normal weather in BC throughout the winter is a series of Pacific storms that roll across and provide a lot of moisture. But it's a continuous series of storms where it rains for 2 days, cloudy for 2 days, and rains again.
The October 10th forecast also anticipates increasing winds, the result of a disturbance presently off the Pacific coast of the United States. 30-year-old meteorologist Blaine Coulson and his colleagues at the Esquimalt Naval Base in Victoria are watching that disturbance with a great deal of interest.
Our job there was strictly forecasting for the Navy, for the ships. We had nothing to do with public weather. Our forecasts were for the Navy. They were not for public consumption.
On this particular Wednesday, Blaine Coulson and colleague Frank Cushing are tracking a Pacific storm that they feel will eventually hit the British Columbia coast. The storm is all that remains of a typhoon known as Freda, born 7 days earlier near Wake Island, halfway between Hawaii and Guam. Unlike hurricanes that come in from the Atlantic, typhoons rarely hit North America. And Freda is a comparatively weak cyclone that dissipates into an extratropical storm as it spirals eastward toward the Pacific coast of the United States. Late Wednesday, October 10th, 1962. Stormy, rainy weather moves over Victoria and Vancouver as expected. But Navy meteorologists Blaine Coulson and Frank Cushing are betting that something more is on the way, headed for the waters along British Columbia's south coast.
We did get the public forecast, but they issued weather warnings, yes. But I don't think any of them went so far as to predict the strength, the peak strength of the winds. We at the Naval Weather Office, we came out and said 90 miles an hour peak gusts. That today's language is 150 kilometers peak gusts.
Knowing that the naval fleet is currently on maneuvers north of Vancouver Island, Coulson and Cushing take their forecast to Rear Admiral Edward Finch Noyes.
We told him, please don't bring your ships in, it's not advisable. Well, he believed us right away, and he left them there, and that was that.
Friday, October 12th, 1962. Families across the United States celebrate Columbus Day, commemorating the explorers' first arrival on North American shores. But another arrival on the shores of Northern California will make this Columbus Day like no other.
Oh, I went to work, and the first thing I looked at was the latest surface weather map to find out where this storm was. And it had barreled across the Pacific at a tremendous rate and then started to recurve and recurve right up the coast, and that's exactly what we expected.
The ferocity of the winds catches coastal communities in California, Oregon, and Washington by surprise. Automobiles are tossed off the road and power lines topple. Century-old trees are uprooted and vast areas of valuable timber decimated. Wind gauges in some locations register over 200 kilometers per hour before being destroyed. As many as 35 fatalities are reported in the 3 Pacific Coast states, with serious injuries in the hundreds. And still, the storm tracks relentlessly northward, headed for British Columbia.
The storm had kind of run up the Oregon and Washington coast, and so it was known it was coming. The question is where it was going to track.
The warnings were issued to some extent, but the general public were really, they didn't take the warnings too seriously, and so as a result, there was chaos.
Friday, October 12th, 1962. Halfway between the British Columbia mainland and Vancouver Island, 42-year-old Toshikazu Koyama finishes another day of fishing and anchors his boat as he always does, not far from shore.
His boat was moored about 100 yards offshore from his house.
In Vancouver, 76-year-old Renee Archibald is enjoying her visit with her family, despite the forecast for more wet and windy weather. Today, Renee, her daughter Yvonne, and son-in-law Leslie King are in North Vancouver, spending time with Renee's son Charles. Not far away, student Rod McLeod is on a field trip, collecting fish samples for one of his university courses.
So we're down at Stanley Park near Lumberman's Arch, which is on sort of the northeast side of the park, facing Burrard Inlet. And we had to time the field trip so that there'd be a high tide. And the great plan was in the class, we would go down and do our field trip in Stanley Park, and then we'd head to some bar.
At the Esquimalt Naval Base in Victoria, meteorologist Blaine Colcher keeps a close eye on the weather station's barometer. He and his colleagues have forecast unusually high winds to Navy superiors, but so far, that hasn't come to pass.
The night of the 12th, about 8 o'clock, the barometer was going way down, really falling. I mean, it was practically a nosedive, and no wind. I thought to myself, I better get out of the weather office. So I left. And I went to the a place and had a beer. Well, you know, after a day's work. While I was sitting there, the wind went up from practically nothing, howling winds up to 90 kilometers an hour with gusts up to about 140, 150 kilometers per hour. The strongest gust ever reported in Victoria. It was basically roofs being ripped off, trees being down, power lines, etc. And also on the at the airport, some light planes were flipped over, and a big Mars water bomber, which is enormous, it was torn from its moorings. They were really weighted down and tied down to the ground. They was towed right off, just broke the moorings and flipped it. So that was the strength of the wind there.
100 kilometers away, Toshikazu Koyama has his own boat to protect. His livelihood is anchored on the seething waters off Main Island, and he has no choice but to try and protect it.
Around 10 o'clock, was quite gusty wind and so he decided to go to his boat and check and see if the mooring will hold. So that was the only concern about his boat drags and wrecked his boat, so he was concerned. In the middle of the storm, the gust of wind came and probably go out of balance, and he fell into the boat with his boots on. So I'm sure he couldn't kick off his boots completely, so I guess he drowned.
Upwind from Toshikazu Koyama, another fisherman fights his own battle, trying to secure his boat to a nearby wharf.
He came down and was watching his boat, how we react to the storm. And all of a sudden, he noticed my brother's calf passed by, you know, and the gush of wind came. And instantly, he felt death in the air.
Meanwhile, in Vancouver, student Rod McLeod notices a change in the waters around him.
I think the first indication that I had there was something wrong was this surf building in Burrard Inlet. And you know, if you saw anything like a ripple on that water, it was very unusual. But here there was a surf about maybe 2 feet high. And it was getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And when the trees started to break, branches and debris started to fly off the trees, that's when we sort of thought, wow, I think we better call an end to this little fishing derby and get the hell out of there. I think one of the final straws is a big tree that fell down in a parking lot, which was sort of just adjacent to Lumberman's Arch. There was like maybe 4 of us that picked up the little skiff, and we just followed the professor up to the aquarium. And as we were walking, you know, you're looking up at these tall trees that are kind of like going like this, bending over. Me and 2 classmates, we just headed out. Just wanted to get out of there. I think we were still thinking, it's beer time. Went into the eye of the storm, if you like.
The focal point of the storm is the causeway that snakes through Vancouver's Stanley Park. As savage winds rage through centuries-old forest, the causeway becomes an obstacle course of fallen trees and downed power lines. Returning from North Vancouver with his wife Yvonne and her mother Renee Archibald, Leslie King stops to allow oncoming traffic to pass a fallen tree, partially blocking the causeway. Suddenly, another tree 10 meters tall and over 40 centimeters thick slams down on the rear of the vehicle, crumpling the roof like paper. Although Leslie King is able to rescue his injured wife, one look tells him that it is too late for her mother, Renee. Not far away, in the forests of Stanley Park, Rod McLeod and his 2 classmates try to find their way home.
I can remember the cracking of the trees more than I can remember the roar of the wind. I could just hear the trees moving against one another, and a lot of cracks going off, like splitting off, you know, when you take a stick and you break it. A lot of that, like thousands of those sounds. It was just this debris field that was just in your face as you were walking out of it. Little branches and flying all over the place. Somehow we walked through this minefield of debris and got out of it. But walking home, it was the same thing. There was all these garbage cans flying through the air and pieces of like plant life and wood and that type of thing flying just in the air. Electrical wires were down, sparking all over the streets. I remember I saw a trolley bus that with its poles, you know, sort of off the wires.
By the time Rod McLeod makes it back to campus, the morning sun is rising and the wind already diminishing. But the destruction and despair it leaves behind will be longer lasting.
In the park, this is where really the most significant damage for the city occurs. Most of the damage was estimated at the time in the neighborhood about $10 million. In Stanley Park, they were estimated about 3,000 or more trees were uprooted or destroyed in the park because of the storm.
Some of those fallen trees take a further toll. While there are no deaths in her hometown of Victoria, 76-year-old Renee Archibald is one of 3 people killed in Stanley Park on October 12th. One death occurs not far from where Rod McLeod and his classmates were gathering samples for their field trip. On Saturday the 13th, 4 more Vancouver residents are added to the list of fatalities during cleanup after the storm, including a Highways Department foreman crushed by a fallen tree he is trying to remove. Police initiate a search for the body of Toshikazu Koyama in the now calm waters off Main Island.
RCMP came immediately and started diving around the bay there to look for his body. And lots of fishermen even from the West Coast and some from Steveston came to look for his body within a day after the storm.
The loss of Toshikazu Koyama brings the final death toll to 8 in British Columbia, added to the 35 killed south of the border. In Vancouver, It takes several years and millions of dollars to clear areas of Stanley Park damaged by the storm. But there is a silver lining to the terrible tragedy.
The park board, officially on its website, remembers the storm and notes it as a fairly significant event for Stanley Park. It cleared a lot of the tree cover, and they attribute the storm clearing the tree cover to the construction of the miniature railway in the park. So today where the miniature railway is where a whole bunch of trees had once been cleared.
We have a weather services that are much better prepared to give us warnings several days in advance rather than one day advance as it was in 1900.
But you're never going to be 100% accurate with weather forecasting. It's impossible. Nature just won't allow that.
As recent hurricanes have shown, nature continues to do just that. We can only hope that improvements in weather forecasting and communications will continue, so that the toll taken by the Galveston hurricane, Typhoon Freda, and the storms that have come since will forever remain a part of the past. But for those bound by fate to nature's fury, it is something that will linger forever.
It wasn't just my grandfather, it was all those people. They were lost in that gale, and all those little children had no parent, no father. My life would probably be a whole lot different, because our life was changed from that day. From the day he drowned until today. You don't forget things like that. You know, some people never talk about it, but they don't say they don't remember.